Class is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Today is September 11th. I'm Donna Will, Professional Development Coordinator for the Developmental Disabilities Administration. We welcome you to the revised Person-Centered Planning Process Detailed Service Authorization Tool. Our presenters for today are Patricia Sestoki, Director of Programs, Drew Smith and Aaron Levitin, who are both consultants for DDA. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few things about the webinar. All participants are in listen-only mode. There are two options for listening to the webinar, and that's by computer and smartphone. And we also have 3 handouts, which you can find in the panel to your right. They can also be emailed on request. We are recording the webinar, and any questions you have can be typed in the question box in the webinar panel, and we'll try to get to those at the end. So now I'd like to introduce Patricia Sestoki. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Donna. Thank you, and thank all of you who are joining us. It looks like we have a little over 680 plus participants in our webcast this afternoon. So really want to take the opportunity to thank you all for joining us, and hopefully by now you've had an opportunity to read the letter from the Deputy Secretary Bernard Simons and also the detailed service authorization tool, and have been able to really familiarize yourself with today. So today we're going to talk about an overview and a background of why is it that we created this tool, why is it that we're doing this and we're presenting this to you today, what is the purpose of the detailed service authorization tool and how it will be used. We're also going to take some time to demonstrate how to complete the tool, what is the functionality, the information fields in the tool, and then the tool submission process. And then we're going to open it up for questions. So in essence, we're going to do a quick presentation and then just open it up for a dialogue between you and the DDA. Next slide, please. So just to kind of give you a background, the DDA has been working with the coordinators of community services and providers to identify potential areas to improve a person-centered process or services. And with that, we also learned that the CCSs were already coming up with some tools or cheat sheets in working when they're putting together their person-centered plan and their service authorization. And then the providers were having some concerns about that the information that they talked about or submitted didn't really quite match or wasn't correct. And so based on that, we learned that there were some tools out there that were being utilized. And we're like, okay, well, let's get together with the people who are putting tools and they're putting creative. And I have to say, your providers, you have come up with some really good ideas. So we thought, why reinvent the wheel? Let's see where people are. Let's see what they're doing. And then from there, let's see if we can reduce the number of times the clarification request needs to come in to the regional offices. And then what does the CCS needs to do? And then reduce the back and forth communication between the service authorization between the CCS and the provider. So that was the main goal. And we learned that there was already lots of that happening. So next slide. Based on that, we used what was being developed by some of the CCSs and the providers, and then we decided that we were going to figure out how we're going to together put something that could be used. And then this is how we came up with the proposed detailed service authorization tool. It is a tool. It is not a replacement of the LTSS Maryland detailed service authorization. And so you in the memo from our Deputy Secretary Bernard Simons, you see that this is a tool that the DDA is asking, and it will be a mandatory component of the person-centered planning process. And this is mainly to effectively make sure that there's clear communication and consistency between of what's being discussed in pre-meetings and where you guys land when it comes to what services you're proposing or being submitting for authorization by the DDA. So this becomes a mandatory tool. It would be completed by the provider and sent to the CCS. and we want to make sure that it's uploaded by the CCS into LTSS Maryland prior to submission of the plan for the renewal of the office. So we want to make sure that everything, and I think that what this does, it really makes sure it aims to improve the communication between a provider agency and the CCS and also DDA. So we're all on the same page of what is being requested, what is being done. And so we're hoping that we're able to achieve that. Next slide, please. So the detailed service authorization tool will be used to a couple of things. Front load the PCP process with information about how the person is currently being supported or how a provider would propose to support the participants moving forward. So what did you did in your pre-meeting? What did you did in the PCP meeting? And so that way it's very clear. And then what happens is then the tool will then be able to bridge that gap of communication. The tool will not be used to supplement or reduce or modify the intent of the process that occurs during the planning meeting. It's more of a way to communicate. I call it like a cheat sheet. What is it that you need to do to be able to make sure that everything that you gather from the team and from the members of the person's team are properly uploaded or transferred into the LTSS Maryland. And then we just have in big bold highlighted that the detailed service authorization is a proposed authorization. The planning meeting will determine the final authorization. Okay, so next slide. So I am going to turn this over to Drew, who is going to upload on the screen right now the actual tool. We're going to walk through the tool. We're going to show you all the different tabs, and then we're going to open it up for questions and answers. So go ahead, Drew.
Great. Thanks, Patricia, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to walk through the detailed service authorization tool. As Patricia noted, so the tool was sent out prior, with the memo from the Deputy Secretary, and so hopefully folks have had an opportunity to take a look at it and become generally familiar with it. We did make a few slight modifications to the tool, nothing of substance, really just in some of the field inputs. So the tool that we are showing today is slightly different from that was originally sent out, but I know that it's part of the attachment. So what we're showing today is the same tool that's available in the handouts for the presentation. So, I think as Patricia laid out, the intent here is to walk through the structure of the tool, talk a little bit about how the information is meant to work together, where fields carry over, and kind of what that process is, and then to really just put in some data fields and say, this is what it is intended to be able to show, and how we would hope that folks can navigate this. I'll be honest. I think once people have gotten into the tool, it should hopefully be pretty self-explanatory. So I think today is just to make sure that we're all talking about the same way, and then really to focus the remainder of the presentation on answering questions about it. And so let's go ahead and get started. So hopefully everybody can see my screen. Patricia, let me know if you can't, but we'll start on the instructions page. Okay, perfect. Perfect. So really what we wanted to do is to lay this out as clearly as possible. So knowing that there are likely going to be a lot of folks who are inputting data, but then also what is it that's going to be needed when the data comes through to the CCS and potentially gets then inputted into LTSS. And so we put a lot of time into thinking about really what are the fields that we need to include so that there is a good crossover with LTSS Maryland, without asking everybody to input, too much data. And so as we walk through the instructions, what you'll see is a general overview. This again is similar to the parameters that were identified in the memo from the Deputy Secretary. Things that are in red, you'll see really called out as areas of reminders. And so what you'll see here in this first overview is an expectation of how service units are captured within the DSA. So with the exception of service units that are billed as milestone payments, everything is going to be captured in this tool as hours of support per week. We know that some services are monthly supports, and some like residential, there's a presumption of if you're getting it, as one day of the month, you're going to be getting it for the entirety of the month. But really what we're trying to do here is, to the degree possible, is standardize on this front end, again, as this tool's intent is to be for information collection and sharing, to the extent that we can, to really standardize some of that terminology and some of the ways that we're looking at this. The value of that, I think, is LTSS Maryland has the agility and the capacity to then make those conversions on its side. So we didn't feel like the tool needed to make all of those conversions, but really LTSS Maryland would make those conversions. So as we work our way down, we'll spend time going through each of these sheets. So I'm not going to go into extreme detail into the instructions on each sheet here, but we'll walk through it really in our example. But what you'll see on the instructions are really the fields that we're asking people to input data, and specifically what type of data would be inputted there. And so here for the cover sheet, for example, we see the primary components around the individual who's receiving services, the information that's being completed there for them. The next step there around, how do you use the service selection component. So anything in blue here as a heading is an area where a data input will occur. Everything else, as you'll see as we get into the tool, is really locked because we, again, wanted to limit the amount of input areas that somebody had to fill this out. We didn't want anybody to have to spend 3 weeks on filling out a tool that is going to be supplementary information. We really wanted to look, to Patricia's point, of how do we streamline a process, again, really with the intent of helping everyone just think about this consistently to really identify a way to reduce that back and forth. So again, as we go down, we'll see that for each of the service categories, we again have the instructions. And then towards the end of the form, you'll see that we talk a little bit about how the form will be submitted, and then again, how the form will be uploaded. So as Patricia identified, the intent of the form is to be something that is completed by the provider agency for the services that they provide to an individual. So understanding that one individual might access different services from different providers, the expectation here is if I'm providing residential supports to somebody, but not currently doing their day services or any other support services, that I would just do the residential services for that person using the tool. So I would complete it. I would then either print it and scan it and send it to the CCS, or I would print it as a PDF and send it securely to the CCS. Once the CCS gets it, they would then be able to review the form, use it as a component of the planning process, and then they would take that next step of uploading the form into LTSS Maryland. So what you'll see then is that upload process for the form, and really the standardization around how file labeling will occur from the CCS perspective, and that form would then get put into the system. What you may have seen from the letter or the memo released by the Deputy Secretary is, this becomes a component now of the regional office review for finalization of plans. And so part of the expectation here will be to see this form as an attachment in the PCP as the regional offices are going through and doing that process. And if not, to then reach back out to the CCS and say, hey, do you have this? And if so, let's get it uploaded. So we'll move now into the tool itself. So we'll talk a little bit about the intent of the construction of the tool and kind of how these pieces work together, and then we'll start to work through some actual examples. So you'll see here that we start on the cover sheet. Now, the intent of the cover sheet as we were developing this was, there are a lot of services that may be provided to an individual, and as this information comes back to a CCS, if we were to say, go through all of these fields and make sure that you don't miss any that were selected that this provider is providing, there's a high likelihood that something would be missed. So the intent of the cover sheet is to do two things. One is to, start the process of identifying the individual who the provider is responding to for service. And the second is to be a cover sheet that goes back to the CCS that has identified what services the provider agency is responding to. So from the CCS perspective, they're not, again, going through all of the individual service line sheets. they can look at this and say, okay, I need to make sure that I go in and look specifically at career exploration or supported living or family and peer mentoring supports, because those are the services specific for this provider. Following that, and what we'll walk through after we test out the cover sheet, is you'll see we've broken out and we've aligned the coloring of the service structures here around meaningful day, residential, and support services to the 3 tabs that follow the cover sheet within the tool. And so, again, what we didn't want to make this was one sheet with all services, because we would all go cross-eyed trying to kind of follow down that list. So really, how do we group these services together in a meaningful way that really allows the provider agency who's completing the form to go in and specifically respond to the services that they are completing, and then as it's transmitted back to the CCS, to reduce how much information has to go back that is not relevant to the services being provided by that agency. So we'll take a look at how this form gets filled out. So what you'll notice is up at the top of the cover sheet, in all these gray boxes, are data inputs. What you'll see, and what we'll be able to see when we move into a service-specific sheet, is this is the only time in which you will input the individual who's receiving service, their information into the form. This information will then carry over to the 3 service line forms that follow. So again, what we wanted to do was reduce the amount of time you spent putting in information, and where we could, to make it a single action, but 2, for consistency, to make sure that there wasn't a misspelling of a name on one sheet versus another sheet, because there were so many inputs that were being completed. The other piece of this is, as the form is being submitted back to the CCS, we wanted to make sure that this information carried over to all of those other sheets, so that if for some reason when it got scanned to be sent back, the sheets ended up getting mixed up or put together with another file, that the CCS could easily reconcile that. So again, they're not having to go back to the provider and say, hey, I think I'm missing sheet 1 or sheet 2 or sheet 3 for this individual, but really it makes it a lot easier to follow. So as we fill it out, I'm going to use myself and my colleagues as examples here. So I'm going to say that the participant name is me. My LTSS ID is going to be 11111. My provider name is going to be DEA Agency 1. My friend Aaron Leviton is the one completing this form for me. When we get over to plan type, you'll see that we have 3 options to select from. So we have an initial plan, an annual plan, and a revised plan. So for my example, I'm going to say that this is my annual plan. My plan date is going to be 12/1/2020. And the date that that Aaron is sending this back to the CCS is going to be 11/1/2020. And then, just in case there are any questions specific to the form that was completed here, I'm going to go ahead and say that Aaron's email is aaron@test.com. Okay. So now, quickly before we select the services, what you'll see is across each of the other residential tabs, all of that information is pulled over. You actually can't edit it here. You would have to edit it on the cover sheet. So now, as we look at the rest of the form, the intent here again is to select which forms do you want, or which services do you want to identify that you as a provider are going to select. So we're just going to pick some examples at random here. And I'm going to say that I am receiving employment discovery, I am receiving community living group home, and personal supports, but I'm also getting personal supports with an Appendix K add-on, just because we are in the midst of the pandemic still. So the cover sheet now is complete. I've done my job. I've identified my services. I can do a quick check and see that really there's nothing left for me to do. So now my job is to go through those 3 tabs. So what I know is, because I'm providing 3 relatively comprehensive services to an individual, I need to fill out all 3 tabs. So as I go into this, again, we see that the information for me as a service participant has crossed over. We'll also notice that a green X, or a white X and a green box, has come up next to employment discovery. And really what that is to do is to say, we want to make sure that as you fill out the cover sheet for the services, you remember as you go into this other field, without having to go back multiple times, that that's a service that you need to complete. So we'll see then that I'm going to fill this one out. I can do a quick check, no other employment or day services for me to fill out. Now is the part where we'll start to go through and fill out for the specific service. So a couple of notes here. Across all pages, we put this reminder, unless something is billed as a milestone payment or has some other set unit that wouldn't support this, all units should be inputted as hours of support per week. What we also then have is down the right-hand side for service-specific notes around what the agency should be considering as they're inputting the notes into the system, or additional notes that might be needed, or information about what types of units would be expected. So here what I can see is for my employment services discovery, which is a milestone payment, I need to think about this of, if I'm new to this service, I would be requesting, potentially 1, 2, and 3 milestones. If this is a plan that is crossing over where I started the service last year and it's crossing over into a new plan year for me, I may just be requesting milestone 2 or milestone 3. So I'm going to go ahead and fill this out for myself. So here I'm going to say that I am going to request milestone 1, 2, and 3. You'll notice that across all of the data input areas by service, we try to keep information quite consistent. And so there are really 4 areas of input. First is the number of units that are being requested. Second is the medical assistance number associated with the service or the site. Third are the notes. And then fourth are the months in which the service is being requested. So I'm going to say that my medical ID is going to be, let's say, 4455. And then I might put in notes of this is a new service for Drew. And anything else relevant to really the intent here is to say, why are you requesting a service, especially if it's new? So anything that's going to help really with the CCS's process of working with the individual to say, the provider said this is a service that you're interested in. Are you really interested in it? Here's what they're requesting as far as an authorization. Does that seem to make sense? So I add my notes, and then we go through and say, well, what months am I going to request the service? So I'm going to ask for it in January, February, March, April, and May. So really, hopefully what you'll find is the inputs here by service are pretty straightforward. Pretty user-friendly. We really tried to make this as few mouse clicks as possible and as few key clicks as possible. And so again, really what we're just asking for is what is the unit number that you're asking for? What's the provider medical assistance number? Again, either associated with the service or with the site when appropriate. A few notes about how the service is going to be provided, and then when you're asking for that authorization to be available. Again, our intent here is to see, to the extent we can, and for those of you who are very familiar with how information gets inputted into LTSS Maryland or how you can view material or information in LTSS Maryland, hopefully this seems, a logical approach to how this will work as this information gets transferred over. So that's day services. Or meaningful day services. So let's move into residential. So again, as I move into residential, what I see is that all that information is pulled over. I see that my X's have pulled over for what services I need to complete. So I'm going to complete my information on community living group home. Now I'm going to say that I need this for 12 months. My site number is going to be 55. Let's see, Drew has lived at this site for 2 years and wishes to continue. And then I would say, just as a double check to make sure that everything is aligning, I'm going to select all 12 months to say, yep, Drew is planning to be here throughout the year. Now, a quick note around community living group home. So as most of you, I think, are aware, community living group home in LTSS Maryland currently defaults to awake overnight staffing. And so, one option in the notes is if you're supporting somebody at a home who, you don't currently operate overnight staffing or awake overnight staffing, and you do not believe that you will need to, you can put into the notes to say, this is not a home, or this individual does not need awake overnight, and request that the awake overnight staffing service not be associated in LTSS Maryland. That way the CCS could then say, okay, we now have justification and we can modify that and put what is the quote unquote standard rate back into the number of hours that someone will receive. Next, what I see is dedicated hours for community living group home were selected. So I'm going to say that I need 1-to-1 hours, and my agency, Erin, is going to request 25 hours a week of dedicated supports for me. You know, my information stays the same, and I'm going to be asking for that, you know, again, every month that I'm in my community living group home setting. So as we look down the residential option, again, no other green X's for me to go through, nothing else for me to complete. So I'm going to move my way into support services. Support services, you'll notice that we have a lot more in the area to the right around details. So, you know, support services gets a little bit more nuanced in how services are requested and how services are provided. And so again, what we really wanted to do is be as direct as possible of expectations of what types of information would be inputted into this, and really assist to the degree possible whoever's completing the form to make it, again, as standard as it can be, but also ensure that when it is submitted that first time back to the CCS, that all the relevant information is included, so we can reduce the amount of back and forth, and really hope that this tool can assist in that. So again, all of my details have followed over from that initial cover sheet. As I scroll down, looking for my green X's, I come down to my personal support hours, and I see, okay, now it's time for me to go and put data in here. I'm going to request 30 hours of personal support. So I'm going to put in my false ID number. And then we've got to remember to include proposed skills and schedule of support. So I'm going to say, I'm just going to put in a note about my schedule of support. So Drew needs 6 hours per day, Monday through Friday. Okay. And I'm going to say we're going to request this just in a time limited duration, really from, you know, January through April. Now, what you'll also see is we have added a separate breakout for personal supports for the Appendix K add-ons due to COVID-19. So as I'm sure all of you know, there is not a specific service code in LTSS for the add-on hours for Appendix K. But, you know, as we started to think about this and think about, you know, how do we make sure as this process goes forward, we don't lose track of those hours and we account for them in LTSS Maryland, but also, you know, when the pandemic ends or when the Appendix K is no longer relevant or valid, then when, you know, how do we make sure that we have record to be able to pull those hours out so that, you know, we don't over authorize. So we have added this in to be able to capture those hours. Now, a few notes about that. What you'll see is as you go to select the months, we have limited the month selection options from September of 2020 to March of 2021. So again, this is aligning with currently the expiration date of the Appendix K. And so, you know, to avoid additional hours getting added into the system, we thought if we can constrain that as much as possible so that as the CCS is reviewing this and they're putting these hours into personal supports as that main bucket, then they could go ahead and say, okay, well, we see that, you know, Drew needs 30 hours a week, you know, from January through February. There's a request for 15 additional hours, January, February, and March. That as they go and put in April, it should be easier to say, oh, well, you know, in April, it's not 45 hours, it goes back to 30. So, you know, this is hopefully going to help to reduce any need to do a revised plan after the Appendix K. So again, to the extent that we can, we're trying to limit that kind of that back and forth of having to continue to make modifications to the plan and really collect as much information up front, you know, really to go into that planning process with as much information as possible to streamline the approach. So, you know, as we look through the entire tool, again, you'll see that we do have a lot more information or suggestions around types of information that will be needed in personal supports. But again, you know, hopefully as you've taken a look at the tool, those are helpful reminders. I mean, if there are suggestions, I think that, you know, with any tool that gets released like this, I mean, something that I think looks relatively straightforward, but as you can imagine, there are a lot of moving pieces behind it. So, as folks are using it, we anticipate that it will continue to develop, but hopefully that as we come out the gate with this and really do this initial release, that it does seem to be a tool that can assist in the process, that the types of information we're asking for are not administratively burdensome from the provider agencies, nor is it administratively burdensome from a CCS perspective of being able to take a look at this information and use it. So the last thing I will note before, Patricia, I can pass it back to you and Donna, and we can ask for questions, is to make this again as easy to use once it's done. So I've completed all my service inputs for the services that I'm requesting. I'm going to then print this to a PDF, or I'm going to print this to my printer and scan it and send it back to CCS. We've set up all of these pages already for print, and so you won't have to reformat. You can just go ahead and say Control P. We can show an example of this now. Let's see if it will pull up here for us. Oh, my printer's not going to work. Let's see if we can just do a print preview. But all of the formatting in the structure of the page has already been set up where page breaks have been inserted, and there shouldn't be any need for additional formatting. So, as you go through and you can see the page breaks here, we've got a broken in services, so there shouldn't be bleed over. So again, from a review perspective, but also from just a consistency of information perspective, all of that should be pre-set up for you. So, after I've completed this, I've printed off my cover sheet, and because I'm providing services across meaningful day residential support services for this person, I would print all 4 of these pages. I don't need to print the instructions page, and then I would send all of them with the cover page on the front back to the CCS of record. So I will pause there. I hope that we've been able to walk through enough of the intent of the tool and kind of the functionality, but I'm guessing there are likely questions, and want to make sure that we have adequate time for that. So Patricia, I will pass it back to you and Donna, and we can open it up.
Thanks, Drew. Yeah, there is lots of questions in the chat box, and some are specific tool questions and some are program questions. And so I've asked Aaron to help us with the questions because I want to make sure that we talk specifically about the tool, and if they're program questions, then we try to answer them. And some of the questions in the chart are basically me having to tell people to go back to the waiver and read what that service definition is. So I've been typing some answers in the chat box. But go ahead, let's open up for questions. Aaron, do you want to start us off? And
Yeah,
Drew,
hi everyone.
Drew, leave the tool up because you'll have to go back and navigate and show. If you could do that, that'd be great.
Sure.
Yeah, because I think one of them specifically, can you go to the first page where it says plan type? And people want to know what should they do there, and what is the planned date that they should be putting on there. And so you want to go ahead, Aaron.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you everybody for being interactive. We know it's hard to do these things through a chat box and remotely, and we just appreciate everybody dialing in and asking questions. And we'll work through as many as we can. I've combined as many as I can, and what we don't get to gives us a really good start for guidance. We know that there's been some people have experienced sound problems. The webinar is being recorded. The sound has worked through all of it, and it will be posted. And so you'll have access to it that way. So Drew, let's start with what Patricia was asking, which is we've gotten a number of questions about what is the plan type? And then once you've selected the plan type, what does that mean in terms of which months you select for a particular service?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So what happens here is I selected that I have an annual plan, right? My plan starts on 12/1. And then, as an example of that, let's go into a day service, right? So maybe I'm going to ask for my milestone service of employment service and discovery. Now, if my plan starts on December, then I should not be asking, well, this is a little confusing. Let me back up here. Let's use a plan to start date that starts more in the middle of a year, right? So let's say my plan start date is actually July 1. Let me change it here so that we're all looking at the same information. 2020, and this is going to be 06/01/2020. So as we go back, so if my plan date starts in June, then, really what I need to be cognizant of is for a time-limited service that, let's say it's a service that can only last for 3 months. So as we look at, for example, job development, it's limited to 90 hours total. Or as we look at, the co-worker employment supports, it's limited to the first 3 months on the job. Then we need to be mindful of when the plan date is, and then when the services are selected. So if I'm saying that I'm going to do co-worker employment supports, my plan date is in July, then I shouldn't be requesting, more than services that cross that first 3 months. And so really, I think this is something that in many instances, especially services that are really an annual service, so thinking about those residential services that, we would anticipate to be a full 12 months, this is not an issue. Really where this becomes an issue and just something that needs to be paid attention to is in those time-limited duration services, because, if those services are requested above and beyond, then we would expect that a CCS would go back and say, hey, you requested 6 months of a 3-month service. Can we have some clarification? Which 3 months do you really want to have that in? So, that's part of where we're really relying on the provider to really kind of follow some of those details, keep an eye on it. That's where we've tried to really flag this in red as reminders. But it is a really good question of, how do we make sure that we are connecting the information around what the date of the plan start is with what the date of the service requests are.
Yeah, thanks, Drew. And can you talk specifically about milestone services? I see you're pulled up there. There are some notes in red about that. There were 3 or 4 questions about how do you know which months to select in a milestone service?
Yeah, that's a good question. And, Patricia, I would maybe ask if you want to chime in here a little bit as well. I think that part of that is really go ahead.
So the way that we did the milestone payments, we really wanted to be considered at any time that the person would be able to do that. So you would check when that would happen so that when the service would be completed, then the provider can bill. So we don't know when that's going to happen. So we wanted it to be checked throughout so that people would have the opportunity to not be locked into a specific month or date. And we were going to treat this like upper pay limits so that you could bill them throughout, and you would only just be billing when you actually finish that milestone, because we don't know if you're going to do it September, October, or November, or December. So we wanted to provide that flexibility.
All right. So, I was just going to say there's a couple of questions, that are technical about the tool, but I think there's some overall confusion that really either of you could address around how does this work in terms of PCIS2? Like, how will this relate to what's happening through service authorization and PCIS2?
So there's a couple of things happening right now, only just because this is mainly a tool that is going to be used through the LTSS Maryland to make sure that everything matches when we go into billing into LTSS Maryland. Right now, because we're using 2 systems, you're using the cost detail sheet, and you want that cost detail sheet to match everything that's in the person's plan, and you submit it to bill that way, right? So we want to make sure that, and then we are going to,
Patricia, I think
I've lost.
goal.
Yeah, we lost your sound.
I should have said this in introduction. We want to do a series of trainings about. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you now. But we lost you there, kind of as that introduction into moving into LTSS.
Right. So as we're going into 2 systems, we really wanted to put together a series of trainings for everybody. And we started with the cause detail service authorization right now as the tool, because we want to make sure we're looking at the EVV process. We're looking at personal supports. We wanted people to really understand how that works, because that's right now where we're going to be putting the personal supports and services. We are also working in PCIs2, where we use the cost detail sheet. So we want to also do a training on the cost detail sheet and how do you use the cost detail sheet and submit your plans for approval. So those are really, really good questions. This tool specifically, so that you have all the information so that you can complete everything that you have to in the detailed service authorization of LTSS Maryland. And you use the cost detail sheet for the PCIs to approval and services at this point. And so you want to make sure that all the services that are being built under PCIs 2 has a cost detail sheet, and anything of the services that are being built under the LTSS Maryland, you're using these tools to make sure that is reflected what you guys discuss with the team and the CCSs, and it matches, so that when you actually put it in, the provider gets that service authorization signature sheet, it matches what you've discussed and what you've uploaded and what was approved. Drew, do you want to add to that?
No, I mean, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think that there are a couple of different things coming together right now. And, you know, I think that's part of where really that guidance around that transitionary phase of 7.1 comes into play. But, you know, to the extent that this is relevant to that operational systems, I think, you know, to Patricia's point, the hope here is that, I think, two things. One, we can streamline the process of really how a PCP moves through the cycle and what the communication is and how long that takes and the amount of back and forth. But second, I think, you know, making sure that PCPs that are moving into LTSS Maryland as personal supports moves in and goes live, and then, you know, as other services at some point in the future come in to go live, the best, most reliable, most accurate, and really reflective data of a person's life is captured in that system. And so, you know, that does work into that transition into then how do we get paid in PCIs 2. But really what we're hoping is on the LTSS side that we've got really good person-centered plan data that should then translate more directly into PCIs 2 based off of the other guidance. So, you know, I do think that they are related, but they are also quite separate in intent.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that's helpful. Let's jump to some pretty tactical questions. So the first question is, who's responsible for completing this? So if a person has more than one provider, who fills it out, or do all providers fill it out? And if a provider provides more than one service to the person, do they complete one form or multiple forms?
Yeah, good questions. I'll go ahead and start that off. So to the first around, you know, who completes this? So yeah, so if I'm a provider and I am providing just one service to me, right? So I'm provider of record, and really all I'm doing is residential services. I am then going to only complete residential services for the person that I am providing those supports to. Now, the other providers would come in and they would fill out their services for somebody, you know, let's say Aaron is providing me the meaningful day services and Patricia is doing some support services for me. So 3 forms would go in for me as an individual, each specific to that agency who's making a request for an authorization, only about the services in which that agency is providing. If an agency is providing multiple services, you do not need to provide multiple forms, right? So that's the entire point of the cover sheet here, is to identify which services you are submitting for that person. So again, up top, we see this is specific to one individual. We've got their name, we've got their LTSS ID. And what I'm gonna do is say, for my agency, what am I providing to support Drew? So that might be, I'm doing community living group home services, and I'm doing day services. So I would check both of those on the cover sheet, and then I would fill both of those out in this one time for Drew and send that back. So I only need to fill out one per person I'm supporting for all of the services in which I'm completing for them.
Okay, and then so what if you're working with somebody and you're not currently providing a service for them, but you believe they would benefit from that service and it would help them achieve their goal for the year? You include services that you are not currently providing, but that you expect would be good over the coming year.
No.
Yeah, I'll start, and then Patricia, if you want to add, just kind of, I think we've gone around in this conversation, but yes, right. I mean, because this is not, and getting back to the intent of person-centered planning and what the process looks like, this form is not meant to replace the finalized detailed service authorization in LTSS, right? This is meant to be a proposed detailed service authorization. So me as a provider saying, here's what I'm requesting, understanding that that is not necessarily what has been identified yet in the planning meeting. So if I'm the provider and say, you know, I am on record right now of providing, let's say it's rehabilitation, but I know that Drew really wants to start to get into employment services, then I might, you know, put in the authorization request for rehabilitation, because that's what I'm doing now, but might also then add employment services discovery and say in my notes, you know, Drew and I have been talking a lot about this. I think this is a service that he's really interested in. It's one that we're capable of providing, and think it would really help him achieve his goals. And then when that form goes back to the CCS, and the CCS sits down with me and with my support team, and we talk through that process and we develop our plan, the CCS would say, you know, your provider, Aaron, said that, you know, you might also be interested in employment services and has requested discovery. Is that something that you would like to add into your meaningful days service structure? And if I say yes, then that would then get put into the detailed service authorization into LTSS Maryland. So I think the intent here is to, you know, really push that information forward. If you as a provider who knows somebody really well has identified that as a potential support structure that would help them in their goals, then it should be added, but with sufficient notes to help identify that as, you know, why it's being added and what the intent of it is. And Patricia, I don't know if I've got gaps in that. I know we've talked back and forth on this, so anything to add is always welcome.
Only because this is a tool. It's kind of draft for communication and dialogue, and to make sure that you're looking at everything. So it's a tool. Whatever goes into the LTSS Maryland, it's going to be the final piece. But this is like a working tool for communication to make sure you're covering all the things that the person has expressed that they want to achieve within that year, or they want to work on, or as a goal. So I think that's a really good question, and I think the way you answered is fine.
Thank you. And I just want to stress one point that you both really mentioned, because there are a couple of questions to it, which is this going to replace sort of signing off on the PCP and signing off on the service authorization? The answer is no, right? This is part of a planning process.
This is a cheat tool. Is something that helps facilitate communication, make sure everybody's on the same page, make sure there's an opportunity to agree and disagree, make sure that this is really what the team and the person wants. People are asking, is this only for traditional services? No, this applies across all services, traditional and self-direction, because the services are offered for both, and some are budget authority and some are employer authority. So it applies for both. And we really want folks to think of this as a tool to think about what is the needs of the person, what are the goals that they want to achieve, and how do you come together with all the providers to be able to identify what that looks like.
Yeah, Patricia, on that point, so can you address what should a CCS do if, you know, either they or the person disagrees with what comes in on one of these forms?
So that's a great question, and we're hoping that those forms prior to being submitted, that really both parties, all the parties from the team, family, providers, and CCS haven't had an opportunity to really discuss and talk about what those services. If there is a disagreement, we really want to focus on the access need for that person and the supporting documentation for that access need. And so we're going to be advocating on that presence of what is that assessed need for that person. And hopefully, you know, we can able to, the DDA office and the regional office can assist and facilitate the communication, but we really would want this to be used at the level where providers and CCS at their communication at that table be able to agree to disagree and submit information that really represents that person's need.
Thank you. So flipping to personal supports, and I know that's on everybody's mind as we're getting ready for electronic visit verification. Drew, can you go back to that page, please, and walk folks through how personal supports works, given that some people are still receiving Appendix K hours? I know you talked through that, but it was quick. There are a number of questions coming in around that. The other question that's coming in around that is sort of in the notes box, and this might be better for Patricia to answer. So what goes in there and how much text do the boxes support? So I know that that's a multi-part. I can repeat it if you need it once you get started.
No, that's okay.
All right.
Go ahead, Drew, and then I'll continue after you.
Yeah, perfect. So I think it's a really good question about, how do we account for the Appendix K hours that are currently in there. So as everyone on this line is aware, I mean, there's a really big push right now to look at the PCPs related to personal supports as the transition to EDV occurs. And so I think this is going to be something that's very relevant over the next few months. So the way that LTSS Maryland is set up right now, there are two service options related to personal supports. There's personal supports and personal supports enhanced. There is not a personal supports Appendix K add-on for COVID-19. So what's happening right now is hours are getting added into that personal supports or personal supports enhanced bucket that are really specific to the enhancements related to the Appendix K. And so as we were thinking about this, we saw this as an opportunity to start to delineate those Appendix K hours, because we know at some point, hopefully knock on wood, that we won't be dealing with the COVID pandemic. And so what we'll need to be able to do is, without having to do a full revision of somebody's plan, because we just accounted for those hours generally and we can't then pull them back because we don't know which ones are Appendix K or not, we'll do a specific call out of the Appendix K hours in this tool, so that when it comes to the end of March, or even let's say that the pandemic ends in February, and we need to pull those hours out at some point, we'll know exactly how many there are that were requested per week and what months they were requested in, so that as we look at this and say, in LTSS Maryland, using the amounts we've put in here, it would say that I'm getting 45 hours a week. Well, what we know of that is 30 of those are traditional personal support hours that I need at 6 hours per day, Monday through Friday. 15 of those were add-on hours due to the pandemic. So, as March comes, as the Appendix K, becomes null and void unless the pandemic continues and an extension occurs, then, we can set this up so that effective in March, the system will already account for that, and they'll pull out those additional 15 hours. So we don't have to go back and do a revised plan because we've already captured it here. And so again, the intent here is to stop a future step that would be duplicative, just to go back and to kind of redo the Appendix K hours. So our goal here is to break them out, have record of that, be able to set it up into the system, so that, effective March, I think it's March 12th, those hours could discontinue without somebody having to go through and do a revision.
Okay, in reference to the notes section, Aaron, really this section is more of a way, since the provider is completing this, it's just any information that would support or assist the case manager in really looking at interpreting those services and why they're being requested, so that when there is a question or it's been submitted, or they're able to really justify that service when they're submitting it to the DDA. Some of them don't need any notes. Some may need a note in case you wanted to just make sure that you are maybe at the meeting you all kind of didn't finalize where you were in there. You can say, we really talked to Susie and she really wants job development, and therefore, we're going to do milestones, and our milestones are going to be throughout the year. And, so those are the kinds of things, just some specific notes to support, your reasoning behind or your thinking behind that service request.
From a technical perspective on that, I think, this supports, Patricia, what you just said. We've set this up, and you can see on the screen, to not be, to not show a full, 500 characters, just because, again, I don't think that was the intent of this initially. All of the notes fields are set up to wrap text, so you could include a lot of text here, but I don't think that was the initial intent on the tool side. If we find, as this gets released, that there is, for some reason, a need to expand that, there are a few ways that we can reformat that. But as of right now, it is from a technical side meant to kind of constrain, how much is written there.
And we also know life happens. And so just because you say you're going to do this, we want it to be as broadly, and as if you're going to do a service, just like Drew has on there, need 6 hours of support Monday through Friday. We don't want to know between 3 and 5 and 10 and 2 and all that, because that gets way too complex and too complicated. We're not asking for that. Just want to make sure you guys know we're not asking for that.
Yeah, that's helpful. Drew, here's let's do a kind of a softball. There's a little bit of confusion about the fact that, you know, sort of the months are set up to check off in a calendar basis, right? So it runs January to December, but people's PCP years may start at any time and may start in the middle of a month. How does that all work?
Yeah, great question. And so again, you know, the intent of the month, so what month the PCP starts on is almost irrelevant for the months that are selected in these service boxes, except for the piece that we talked about earlier of, you know, if you're requesting a 3-month service, but your PCP starts in June, then we shouldn't see that extend beyond that 3-month period or whatever that time constraint is. The checkboxes were never meant to be as delineated as a specific date in which the plan started. So if I'm saying that I'm using 30 hours a week of support for personal supports, and I'm requesting it for July, my plan started July 1, but let's say my plan started July 15th. I know that as a CCS, when I'm inputting this data, that I'm going to start that in week 2 of July, right? I mean, what I know is this is going to be a total of 60 hours. And so that gets inputted. The system knows to account for when the start date of a plan is, and so it'll prorate the information. So really, again, the intent isn't to get so nuanced in this information, but to use it as, you know, general constraints around how the information is collected and shared. So the plan date is important just for thinking about when services can begin or when services could be authorized through. But the intent of the calendar is not to be as nuanced as to a day of service that's going to be provided. I think to Patricia's point of, you know, the intent is not to get so detailed and so complex in this process.
I know we are close to being out of time. A couple of you have sent us some requests for changes in the form. Of note, a number of people have pointed out that it would be helpful to have space on that cover sheet, Drew, for provider contact information. So as an example, if you're a provider and you provide both residential and day, there might be a need for more than one person now there. There was a question about whether we'll update this after Amendment 3 is completed. We will. And there was some confusion about how the overnight hours were listed. So we really appreciate all of that feedback. We'll definitely take a look at it. You know, we understand that, you know, this is a living document, and we're committed to working with you to get it right. So please let us know as you begin to use it what else you find. Patricia, I'll turn it over to you now for any closing remarks.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we said in the memo is that if anybody had any questions or specific recommendations, to email me. So please email me, and then I'll work with my team to make sure that we can update or make the appropriate changes. Also, we know that there's a lot of questions on the chat box that we didn't get through. So we're going to use some of those to provide guidance, additional guidance, because I think, you know, I think Drew does a fantastic job, but if it's something new and you haven't used it, it's like Greek. And so we're hoping to provide additional guidance. There's questions about, you know, effective immediately. What does that mean? Because we did the webinar today and we wanted people to get, you know, their hands with it and play with it and look at it, we really put an effective date for September 21st, and that's in the memo. And I know that's been asked a lot in the chat. So I just wanted you guys to know that we are very concerned about making sure that we hear what you're saying. We want to make sure that this tool is not another additional work or headache, but really was to bridge the gap between what we see is happening within the system as it relates to finalizing and getting authorizations signed and approved by both parties, by all parties. So we hope that this, please send us your thoughts, your emails, your recommendations. Be glad to look into it and to tweak it. As Aaron said, this is a living working document, is a tool. for us to use to bridge the gap. So I really thank all of you who've joined us today, and I welcome your emails. If you are going to send me an email specifically about the tool, can you please on the subject line put exactly detailed service authorization, or for sure DSA? That way I'll know that it's specifically that, and I can put them all into one section, so when I meet with the team, I don't miss your email. So thank you all so much, and have a wonderful weekend.